Hello, and welcome to another episode of the B2B Leadership Podcast. My name is Nils Vinje, and today my guest is Ashish Jha. Ashish, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Nils. Really excited to be here.
Wonderful. Well, Ashish, we're going to dig into lots of fun things on your leadership journey. But first, would you mind sharing with me and the audience where you are working today and the role that you're currently in?
Yeah, so currently I'm VP of Engineering at VComply Technologies. So VComply is a startup. It works in the governance, risk, and compliance space. We are in our journey to simplify governance. So what I saw was that in the governance and compliance space, there are a lot of products who are focusing on power users. We are trying to focus on end users, folks who are actually doing the compliance and to the day-to-day business and simplifying their life. So really excited to be part of the journey.
Wow. Okay, so you're simplifying compliance in the government sector. That sounds like a big job. Can you give me an example of what a compliance thing you are helping your clients with? What's a typical use case of VComply?
Yeah, so take an example of any a non-profit organization where they have to do the bookkeeping of, okay, this is what we do on a day-to-day basis. These are our offices. This is how we track our responsibilities or auditable entities. So the typical way they will do today is either via emails, phone calls, screenshots, spreadsheets. So what we are trying to do is automate all that process so that they do it once, it all gets automated, everybody just gets reminders, does it all electronically, very little learning curve. So it becomes a part of the routine. It's no more a hassle, and everything is documented, centralized in our software.
Wow, that sounds pretty cool. Love it. And sounds like a never-ending stream of challenges to solve and problems to solve for your customers. So
that's right.
Very, very cool. So Ashish, let's start talking some leadership. I want to go rewind in your career and would love to hear you share with me and with this audience, how did you get into your first official people leadership position?
Yeah, so let me give you a little bit of background on how I started my career. So I started my career at a startup. And that my day one with them was also the day one of the company. And I was one of the first interns to join in that company, then grew along with that company. And because I started pretty early, I started getting kind of like hiring and leadership roles informally from the very beginning. So I was into the business side of things along with technical from the very early on. So I got interested in that. Then the company grew and we were acquired by Citrix, and that's where the role was actually formalized. But I was into the leadership probably, I would say, a couple of years on in my journey.
That's wonderful. So, I mean, it's a fascinating story. So you were the intern at this company first, right?
That's right.
And for anybody listening who hasn't been part of an early stage company, there's always a lot of opportunity to go around and things to fill, gaps to fill. Let's say, been there myself, and even if you're in an established company, there's still a lot of opportunity all over the place. So I'm curious about how you approached your work as an intern, as in those earlier years, where you were an individual contributor. And then you positioned yourself to take on more and more of those leadership responsibilities, some of it because you had been there since the early days, but I'm sure some of it was because you had shown an interest or you had already started doing the work of the leader. Can you give us an example of what you saw and what you were driven to do?
Yeah, so at a startup, right, you may have a role, but the work may differ on a day-to-day basis. So essentially you do what is required on a given day, on a given week. And that's the attitude which generally helps in a startup. So mine was no different. So in the startup journey, we started with a product, and in that product, technical skills were one thing, and then understanding the ecosystem, who our competitors are. So I started getting exposure to that, and that's what happens when you join a startup. You get exposure to things which probably will take a little longer at other places. And that then helped me get a 360-degree view. and that increased the overall outcome which I was having for the company. And that is what slowly took me towards the leadership eventually.
And was that something that somebody else said, "Hey, Ashish, we need a 360 view. Go and build this. Here's the specs. Here's what you have to work with. Go do that." Or was this something that you identified as, we need this, and kind of went down that path?
Yeah, so no, I was like looking for gaps, like where are we struggling? I mean, where can I help? I mean, I was always on the lookout for things where things are not going great and like there is some help needed, and I will try and learn that, try and go do that work. And so it was like organic process. No one told me how to do it or what to do, but then essentially like you look for things which are going great, continue doing that, and look for things which are not doing great and try and see what is the reason and how you can improve that. And that's the journey which helps you improve continuously.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And it's a wonderful piece of advice, and is a similar thread to what has been shared a lot of times on this podcast with other guests about the fact of looking for the things that are not working and then identifying how you can help improve and do that long before anybody ever comes to you and asks you or tells you to do it, simply because you see it as an opportunity. And I think the biggest difference there is being in control. Like, you were in control. You were the one who decided to look at all these areas and identify where you could add the most value to the organization. It doesn't really matter if you're in a startup or you're in an established company. You could be in a Fortune 100 company. You could still apply the exact same process. And you actually got acquired by Citrix, which is a very, very large software organization. So walk us through the transition of what it was like inside of the startup organization from, kind of inherited leadership responsibilities to then formalization inside of Citrix.
Yeah, so when we got acquired, the biggest thing the difference we saw was suddenly you had access to so much more resources which you can tap into, and so much more experience. So in a startup, we had like a lot of folks, a lot of energy, and who are trying to do a lot of things together. Whereas once you get into a bigger organization, you have well-established roles, folks who have done it over years, and there, the momentum you can get through that expertise is amazing. So that was the big difference which we saw. We were able to divide and conquer much better, and then overall planning, focusing on individual items was much more granular at a bigger organization. So that helped a lot in making, I wouldn't say a lot of diverse progress, but a lot more focused progress on certain areas which we decided that we want to progress.
Wonderful. That's they're different worlds, right? They're completely different worlds. A startup world and an established company like Citrix. And it's wonderful to hear just your perspective, because some people might say things like, well, there's just so much bureaucracy in a large organization, and there's so much process, and you can't, quote unquote, get anything done. And the reality is exactly what you said, which is we had access to infinitely more resources than we did as a small team. And that was really cool. I think that's one of the best descriptions of the differences between a startup and an established company that focuses on the important things, which is getting stuff done. So when you transitioned into Citrix, you mentioned that your leadership position was actually formalized. So is that the point at which then you had individuals who were on a team that reported to you?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. And when you made that transition and when they made it formal, and even if you were working with some of the same team or some new people, walk us through what that transition was like from an environment that was, pretty ad hoc and kind of all over the place to a much more structured environment, probably a lot more resources, as you mentioned, and just a completely different change of pace, I imagine.
Yeah. So starting from like resources, right? So like there was a well-built training programs. We had trainers who we suddenly got access to. So getting to make sure that we can get hooked up to that, understand what are the avenues which we can learn, the team can learn. Then we also got a full university program where we could hire from different universities. So as a startup, you don't have access to some of those. You are trying to figure out, you do few things, whereas here we had a big team. So we were able to tap into that. So the overall, as I said, right, structuring the whole growth for every single individual was much more easier because it was already thought through in many ways.
Fascinating. So now, as you're transitioning, as you now got exposure to more resources, the university hiring program, all kinds of different things, were you ever tempted to go back to the startup world, to leave the big organization? I'm curious about the balance. Sometimes people naturally gravitate towards one or the other, but where did you fall in this, having experienced both sides?
Yeah, so I enjoyed that. I actually went, from Citrix, I went to like even further larger organization, Amazon, spent a couple of years there, and back to the startup world now. So it's kind of been a full circle in that way. Yeah. So each one of them have their own benefits, their strengths. At a startup, you get to do a lot more things. It's a lot more ad hoc, fast-paced. Whereas in the bigger companies, things are much more structured. You have clearly well-defined roles. So you know exactly what you need to do. So it's a well-carved path, whereas in a startup, you make your own path in some ways. So they are both exciting in their own ways.
Yeah, I agree. And I've been in parts of both of them as well, probably skewed more my career towards the earlier stages, but really love the difference between those two. And they have, just like anything, they have their pros, they have their cons, and it depends on the appetite of the individual who wants to be there and the leader in particular. So when you were working it through Citrix and with Amazon, curious if you could share maybe some of the leadership lessons that you learned that really helped you to lead your teams, helped you to get your projects done, help you get your initiatives off the ground. What are some of the key takeaways and things from those large organizations which do a fantastic job of training and enablement that maybe the earlier stage companies don't always get to take advantage of just for lots of different reasons?
Yeah, so couple of things which I really learned about was first was thinking big and a long term. So leadership is it's not about getting things done on a day-to-day basis. That may be a small part of it, but it's also about nurturing the team, figuring out what's needed to help them grow, each individual person in the team, and along with the product, right? So it's not just work, it's about human connect. So knowing each individual person works and behaves differently, their motivations are different, their skill sets may be different, they run at different pace. So leadership is about recognizing and understanding that, and then helping each one of them to get to the best of their potential.
Well said. Thinking big and long term, nurturing your team, helping individuals grow in their respective areas. And it's not just about the product, as sometimes we can get a little bit wrapped up in, right? It's about human connection and helping each one of them along the lines. Is there an example of how you kind of took that long-term view with somebody in one of your teams and help them over a long period of time become, rise up to a much higher level?
Yeah, so I can talk about one particular case where we used to hire, at Citrix, we used to hire from different colleges. So, there was tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 colleges, and each one of them will come and they'll be given a slightly different kind of role depending on where you hire from. So one of the engineers which was hired from a good college, not the tier 1 college, I saw that from the very first day, he showed a lot more interest in the product. He showed a lot more interest in learning things. He was trying out things on his own. Even during the training time, he was trying things which were not asked of him. So I recognized that, and I understood that this person definitely has skills and ability to learn. Now, what can we do to help nurture that? So I took a senior engineer and assigned him as a mentor for that person, so that let's see, if we can get him to grow faster than the others, let's give it a try. So 6 months, that mentorship program worked, and that person did start to grow up. during my duration at tenure there, he got a couple of promotions. He was already like into a leadership kind of path. That is when we thought that he showed interest in both higher education and moving to US. We initiated that path. Unfortunately, during that time, I had to move out of Citrix, move to other. So I had laid out the groundwork. I stayed in touch with that person. Just a month back, I heard from him. He's actually into US now, pursuing his master's and into the company. So yeah, so it took 5 years, but he's here.
That's tremendous. A U.S. citizen going to university and graduate school, and it all started with him showing interest, right? Doing the hard work of, just like you did in your first position with that company you told us about before, in the early stage company, where you saw the holes, you saw the gaps, you pushed beyond whatever boundaries there were, and you didn't wait for somebody else to tell you what to do. And then you hooked him up with a senior engineer to mentor him, and that accelerated his growth. When you pair coaching with potential and talent, you get incredible results. And then, helping him navigate the path all the way up to the point where he's at a very senior leadership position now and is in a tremendous place, completely different than where he would have been had you never shown interest as a leader. Like, had you never spotted that talent and taken an interest and said, you know what, there's something special here. That's really quite remarkable.
And also for a leader, right, that's the best reward you can get.
Yeah. So absolutely. And many times people tell me, like, if people get promoted beyond me, right? Beyond my position. That's wonderful.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's what we should all be championing, is somebody else getting to that position, because it's about their success, right? It's no longer, when you become a leader, it's no longer about you. It's about them.
It is.
That's one of the most freeing things, I think, of it all. It might be scary for some, but to me, it's incredibly freeing. How about to you?
No, absolutely. I mean, like the whole point is that get the maximum potential out of them. I mean, and many of them will have potential higher than your own. So that's absolutely natural for them to keep growing beyond you.
I love it. Love it. And there's no limit to the potential from everybody else, right? Because the world is evolving faster than it ever has before. True. Our work environment evolves faster. The technology and everything about what we do evolves faster and faster and faster all the time. So there's no possible way you as a leader could stay on top of everything necessary. The only way for you to stay on top is to facilitate the growth and development of other people.
Absolutely, yeah. True.
And that's a perfect example of what you did. And I'm sure your relationship with this individual will last for a very, very, very long time, if not your entire lifetime. Awesome. Love it. So coming back to the full circle nature piece. Now, you went to Citrix. You spent a number of years there. You went to Amazon, spent a number of years there. And then you said, I want to go back to the beginning. I want to go back to the startup, and you joined VComply. Share with us a little bit about why coming back to VComply was important for you to join as the VP of Engineering.
Yeah, so one of the things, I mean, last few years I had been into security, audit, compliance space. So technologically, I was in that space. And then I saw this company, and as I said in the beginning, right, like most of the software which are being built for the administrator, power users. Yeah. There's a lack of interest or intent to support those who are doing this on a day-to-day basis, who don't have a lot of technological prowess, let's say. And that's where I saw this company and an opportunity, and I could really connect with the product straight away. Mm-hmm. And that's how I got into touch with the leadership team and explored the opportunity.
That's wonderful. So if I draw a parallel to what you were sharing before about how you got into your first leadership position was by identifying a gap and then coming up with a way that you could help solve that. It sounds like you were doing the exact same thing here at a career level, which was identifying the gap in the market, which was most of the compliance things were built for administrators, and then figuring out how you could address that problem with your unique skill set and background and expertise. And you said the people doing this on a day-to-day may not have the technical, acumen or anything, but you could help them. Is that a fair parallel? Because it seems to be pretty common between those two situations.
Yeah, when I think about it that way, it does seem. I never actually honestly thought in that way. So But that's a good parallel, actually. Like, I mean, good observation. Yeah, it's kind of that.
But that's awesome. That's wonderful. I think it's just, the takeaway here for me, listening to these threads of yours, is that there's been a consistency across the board, and there is with virtually everybody's career, and you get to weave that consistency. And yours has been all about identifying gaps and then filling those gaps with your solutions, your skill set, your leadership, et cetera. So I think it's just cool to see it at multiple different levels, on a product level, on a team level, on a career level, on a mentorship level. It just exists all the way. Because if you're always identifying gaps, there's always going to be a problem to solve, and you can always solve it.
True, and I do believe that, like, I mean, if you're a problem solver, I mean, that's a good value to bring to any table. So anybody who's starting their careers, right? I mean, I also tell them, right, to keep things simple. I mean, don't over plan things. I think just focus on the problem at hand and see what best you can do to solve that.
Yeah, I'm with you. And that, another undercurrent here is just the being a problem solver. And I think that has been a consistent thread across other guests as well, is that the people in the leadership positions, whether you're in that position that you want today or you want to get there, regardless of level, company size, stage, whatever, comes down to your ability to solve problems and solve the right problems. Because there's a lot of problems out there. Let's say that, right? So I'm curious if there is some way that you use to discern what problem you should solve. So whether you're in a startup or late stage company, team, whatever product, there's a lot of problems to solve, always. So how do you identify and kind of get to the point where you say, this is probably the most important thing for me to work on, when there's sometimes endless amounts of choice?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, it's all about, I mean, you only have X hours in a day which you can proactively work, right? So the key thing is to figure out the top priority. And then the top priority for the company and the top priority for each individual may differ. But still needs to have that connection. So the way I try to do is, look for the top priority and then figure out, like, out of those, what are things where I already have redundancy built in. So if somebody can actually do it at the same level or better than me, it's best to, like, pass it on. And then see what else is remaining, and then reprioritize, and then go after that, and not just do it, but also plan on how do you make that also redundant going over. So keep repeating that process. So the idea is to, like, keep making yourself redundant while you keep doing the highest priority work on a given day.
And I love how you called out the fact that even if you are already doing something that is related to a top priority, but if it is redundant for you to do, and that, like, you doing it is not the most important thing, to identify how to pass it on and who to pass it on to. So you're effectively delegating that off your plate so you can focus on the next thing, right? The next most important task. I think that's a really key piece that we should always be looking at. I'm curious, how often do you take a step back and look at these, your priority list? You can tell us what time period, if it was during the Citrix or Amazon days, or even now. How often are you looking at that prioritization list and saying, what can be handed off and what do I need to tackle next? Is that a weekly, monthly, daily thing?
Yeah, so definitely, like, I do deserve, like, some time to reflect back on a weekly basis. So that where I see, like, what I did this week, kind of like closing down to myself, like, what kind of outcomes did I achieve this week? Did I achieve any outcome? If not, where did my time go? And what could I have done better there? So that's a process which I do follow. That generally does give us, like, 2 or 3 pointers every time on where I might have spent time which I should not have, where I probably, like, delegated too early. So things like that, and then you try to learn from that, you try to improvise that. So that's about on a regular basis. But I also do, like, a quarterly thing. In any company which I've worked on, generally try to do, like, quarterly planning, so that you can plan things at a quarterly basis, get the resourcing done, and understand who the key players are, what the gaps are, and, like, what to do about that.
Love it. So that weekly reflection time, I'm curious, how much time do you give yourself to do that weekly reflection?
I would say around 30 minutes. I kind of 30
30
minutes
minutes.
of quiet time to reflect back, and like not a lot of screen time then.
Yeah.
Just it's more about trying to see like, because the outcomes are not too many in a week. I mean,
Yeah.
you may work on 100 things, but like you generally achieve like few outcomes. So focusing on outcomes rather than the effort.
Yeah, that's awesome. And 30 minutes is doable, whether it's on, whatever days of the week you run your week by. Do you typically do it at end of week, like on Fridays?
End of week.
Okay.
Yep. Yep.
So you can run your week by the actual days of the week, like Friday's the end of the week, or you can go from Wednesday to Wednesday, Thursday to Thursday, whatever suits your schedule. But you heard it right there. 30 minutes is all it takes to do reflection and very quickly know were your outcomes lined up with what you expected, and did your time go in the right places? I think that's a really powerful tip here, that just taking that little step back and being honest about your calendar and your time can give you an awful lot of insight in where you should spend next week.
Yeah, and one of the things, I mean, I've also noticed is like we all as people have the tendency to fall back to our strengths, which we perceive as our strengths.
Yep.
So sometimes we overdo it. So that's another thing to be careful of. Like if it is already redundant and probably you need to learn new skills, then like you have to put less time on those skills which you already mastered in past.
That's a great point. And sometimes taking a step back and saying, you know what, like I need to let go of this stuff that I'm really good at, and I need to focus my attention in another area can be kind of challenging. Any words of advice for someone who's in that position where it might be a little bit uncomfortable because you feel like you're really good at doing this, but you know that the growth area is probably going to be someplace else?
Yeah, so I mean, for that, I really like Amazon's way of leadership in some ways, where they say that, I mean, imagine where you want to be 1 year later, and start acting as if you are there.
Love it.
So
that's awesome.
So
Yeah.
think the gap, what between this and 1 year, and plan accordingly. Start learning those things. Start preparing yourself for that. But mentally, you need to feel as if you're already there.
Wow, that's powerful. And I love they brought in the psychology piece, right? All of leadership, everything we've been talking about today, there's elements of psychology, and then there's tactics that go along with it. One without the other, you're going to struggle. But together, if you already believe you're in that future position and you find the tactics and the skills and the strategies and the tools, there's no stopping you. So Ashish, last question here. If you were able to go back in time and sit down with yourself in that early startup that you joined as an intern, as you were kind of making your way through before you got to Citrix, and you know everything you know now, what advice would you give yourself?
I think one advice I will give myself is like spend more time on knowing your customers. I spent a lot of time, and I did spend time on knowing my customers early on, but I spent a lot more time on process, technology, product. But I think like the key thing is to knowing your customers, and like that's what then learning from them, bringing it back on what you do. The more we do from early on, the more tuned our mind becomes in terms of getting the feedback. Otherwise, like to train yourself to get feedback is tough.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say everyone, that like learn your customers from day one.
That's awesome. And just like I'm going to draw another parallel here and check for what you think. But your customers in your companies have been your physical customers, people who pay you money for your service and your product, et cetera.
That's right.
But your customers in your leadership role are your employees.
Employees, that's right.
Right.
Absolutely.
And
Yep.
spend more time on them, getting to know your customers. Because
Exactly.
if you treat them like customers, they have an option to renew with you every single day. They have the option to churn at any point in time, right?
True. That's right. Absolutely right. So, I mean, they are absolutely the customers.
They are, yeah. And they're in charge, and they get to, share. They have a particular vision, and you have to understand what that vision is, and you got to overlay what you have to offer on top so that you can get them to an even greater place.
True.
Simple as that. All right, Ashish. Well, it's been wonderful to spend time with you talking about your experience, and thank you so much for your stories, your wisdom, your experience, and your expertise. And I can't wait to hear about all the great things that you and the VComply team are going to do for the users of those incredible systems that you told us about. So thank you so much. Take care and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks a lot, Nils. Thanks for having me. Thanks a lot. Have it.